Hello, and welcome to the Responsive Family Sleep Podcast. I'm your host, Kim Hawley, holistic sleep coach, lactation consultant, peaceful parenting educator, and mom. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by all the conflicting sleep info, frustrated with sleep information that just plain felt wrong, or searched desperately for a truly gentle and responsive sleep approach, then you are in the right place. In each episode, we'll be answering your most pressing baby and toddler sleep questions, busting those sleep myths, and helping you understand truly developmental, biologically normal baby and toddler sleep, plus encouraging you to trust your intuition along the way. Let's get started. Hello, and welcome back to this week's episode. I am really excited. I think this is a very important conversation we are going to have today, and it is about anxiety and postpartum anxiety and sleep and parenting. And I have a guest, a therapist here to chat with me about this topic. Claire, thank you so much for joining me. I'm excited to chat with you today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Awesome. So Claire, you do a lot of work with anxiety as a therapist. So why don't we'll just start off by sharing a little bit about yourself, and then
Mhm.
we'll jump kind of into the topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so my name is Clare Donofrio. I'm a clinical social worker and a perinatal psychotherapist. I primarily work with people at all stages of the perinatal journey. So from trying to conceive through pregnancy loss, infertility, pregnancy, and then postpartum and into parenting. So definitely have come to develop a bit of a focus clinically on working with people with anxiety. Lots of I say perinatal anxiety because it often does start during pregnancy,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes also can venture into like the OCD category in postpartum. Postpartum OCD is really common, but we don't talk about it a lot, and kind of is on that like anxiety OCD spectrum. And I have a background in just like reproductive health support work. I was a full spectrum doula for a long time and am now a parent of a toddler myself.
That's like such a good, I feel like, uh, coming together for this background to have
Mhm.
the doula background and the mental health background coming
Yes.
together because it's such a special and unique time. I feel like in lots of good ways, but also in lots of challenging ways. Um,
hmm
you know, let's start off. Tell us, like, how do you define when we're talking about the perinatal period and early parenting? And I love that you mentioned that sometimes and often these things show up in pregnancy.
hmm
How do we define like anxiety that we should be, I don't know if you say should be concerned about, but like when we're getting to like clinical level, like postpartum or perinatal anxiety, and we just kind of do some defining and sort of how OCD relates before we kind of jump
hmm
into the specifics about parenting and sleep.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there are a couple different things that I think are the common threads in how anxiety presents. A lot of us have like generalized anxiety, right? And it's very common. Generalized anxiety disorder, one of the most common diagnoses, and that's just when like we're someone who maybe might be more of a worrier, like generally has more like keyed up nervous system, like potentially is just, sometimes people will describe themselves as like an overthinker, right? They just like are a little bit more worried about things. And then, of course, when we go in through the journey of pregnancy and parenting, there's a lot of new things to be worried about and to focus
Mm-hmm.
our anxiety on. So the way we would typically like describe anxiety's presentation would be like excessive worry, just like rumination on things that maybe could go wrong or fears, right? And then with that can often come a physical component and the physiological component, which like, could venture as far into panic attacks, right? Where we actually have this like very acute physiological response where we feel like heart's racing, we're sweating, you know, could feel dizzy or very hot or cold, kind of like a sense of like the wall is closing in, is often how folks experience panic attacks. And that's just like when anxiety has become so acute that it becomes a full body panic experience. But other physical sensations really often accompany anxiety as well, like you know stomach, feeling like GI distress, or lightheaded or tense in the jaw or the shoulders or hips or whatever, different kinds of pain, rapid heart rate or anything like that. And then, yeah, the excessive worry, often just having this lens kind of on the world as if it's a threatening place, right? So, like,
Mm-hmm.
maybe there can always be specific fears or specific things that one feels more anxious about. For example, like health anxiety, right? Like worrying about like getting sick or someone you love getting sick, or, maybe you're really afraid of, you have a lot of anxiety about like safety in your home or like your child, like, ingesting some kind of small piece of something, right? Like there are different things that our anxiety brain like finds to focus on. But in general, I would say it's just this kind of like keyed up, more worried, and then often can, create this kind of like restlessness just in the body, right? So like we want to be continue moving, or it's hard to sit still and hard to relax, and then can totally lead to impacts on sleep for the anxious person, right? So
Yeah.
like insomnia is often a part of anxiety, whether that be like difficulty falling asleep or like quality of sleep for the anxious person. And then the way that it kind of, changes, I think, during pregnancy and postpartum is, obviously if you have, if you have a history of anxiety or depression, you're more likely to experience a postpartum mood or anxiety disorder. So again, just because this is such a stressful time in life, it often
Mm-hmm.
does, crop up in a new way. And during pregnancy, often we see like a fixation on like concern about like the health of the baby or health of oneself. Or it could just be anxiety about becoming a parent. If it's your first time becoming a parent, worries about like, what will my life be like? Will I be able to do this? Is my relationship going to be able to withstand this big change? Yeah. And, I think also like this being the first time that many people are intersecting with the healthcare system is huge, right? With like, going to a lot of medical appointments, having a lot of medical information can be really anxiety interesting health of yourself and your baby, and then in postpartum we have this very fragile human to take care of, and of course there's all the fears that come along with that, like how do I keep this baby alive, how do I know if something's wrong, and the brain changes that the gestational parent goes through are major. So like our amygdala, which is like our fear center, actually grows when we have a baby. So, and
Mm-hmm.
it never goes back, by the way. It never changes back to what we were pre-parenthood. So, and if you think about that from like an evolutionary perspective, right, there's like a function. It's to
Mm-hmm.
make sure that our family is safe, right, to look out for threats. But it can really cause like increase in anxiety postpartum. And then also postpartum OCD is when that kind of those ruminations just kind of grow and grow, and some of the fears become kind of obsessions, and then we engage in compulsions to try to keep our kids safe. So for example, like contamination OCD would be like if you're very afraid of your child like ingesting some kind of germ, and so you're washing bottles like or pump parts like over and over and over, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or for example, what related to sleep, a lot of people are afraid of SIDS, which is totally understandable, but it could create kind of some ways that it interferes with life, right? So like maybe you feel like you can't sleep because you need to be watching the baby all night, or you need to be checking the monitor, or you know you are kind of engaging in some kind of like compulsion that's just feels like it's keeping you safe, right? Which is, all of this is just a misfire, and like your brain's trying to keep you safe, but it's doing too much, right? Like it doesn't
Yeah.
need to be responding this way. Yeah.
Yeah. So true. I mean, obviously when I see parents, they're seeing me for sleep, but I see a lot of parents just really hyper vigilant about
Mm-hmm.
like their little sleep in interesting ways, because anxiety isn't always rational. Um, but also just so unable to sleep even when their baby is sleeping, that their baby sleep might be very average and they're laying awake, like kind of spiraling, ruminating, either because they're worried about the baby or because they're just thinking about the next time the baby's going to wake up. And so
Yeah.
they're actually getting significantly less sleep than they could be, in that situation if their anxiety wasn't keeping them from sleeping.
Yeah. definitely. Yes.
Um, yeah, it's interesting because I feel like these things, like logically, there's like logic and then rationality, and then there's like what our brains, the stories our brains kind of tell us, the narratives
Yes.
they kind of create,
Yeah.
and it's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. And what you're saying makes me think about the fact that that anxious part that really is always like scanning for a threat, right? Like it takes little pieces of information and it can make those pieces of information feel really important, right? So like I think this is where I don't know if you experience this a lot in your work, but like we often see folks who maybe are more prone to anxiety, like might hyperfixate on like, is their baby sleeping the right way? Or is their baby
Yes.
sleeping enough? Or is their baby sleeping according to some schedule that they think they need to be sleeping on? And I think it can cause even more distress, right? Where we are looking for, oh, is this a problem, right? Or like
Mhm.
what am I supposed to be doing? What is the right thing to keep my baby safe? And then I think it leads to a lot of confusion because the anxiety brain is like, I'm seeing this thing, I'm seeing this message, and I'm trying to make sense of it all, which again, right, like you said, leads to so much stress and then like decreased sleep usually for everybody.
Yeah, and I feel like because arguably sleep is like one of the topics that there's the most like misinformation about and
Mm-hmm.
conflicting information about in parenting,
Mm-hmm.
that it's one of those like if sleep is part of what your anxiety is fixating on, there's so much readily available information to really send you on a spiral.
Mm,
Um, and I tell a lot of the parents I work with, whether they're anxious or not, to like, okay, once you've picked your sleep path, like let's just unfollow all the accounts that are not helpful, right? Because we don't
yes.
actually need to take in all the information that's out there just because it's there all the
Mm-hmm.
time. But anxious parents, I feel like that's really important. Is like once you kind of know the direction you're going, like don't don't let yourself keep spiraling because someone out there in the world is saying something. Like you don't necessarily need to take all that in if it's not adding to your experience, like if it's not helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Because it is, there's so much conflicting information. And like, I absolutely see parents fixating on the right way to do stuff. I also see them fixating on like things like what's the best sleep sack? Like what's the exact right
Yeah.
temperature? If I'm a half an hour under their daily sleep amount, am I like ruining their brain development? And it's just these little things that just really get in the way of seeing the big picture, and in the way of kind of relaxing into every day is a bit different, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and that's
Yeah.
that's a normal part of any human sleep,
Right.
not just the baby's sleep.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think, it's also in that immediate postpartum, like first 6 months or so, right? Like usually you are extremely sleep deprived as a parent. And that
Yeah.
is, unfortunately normal, unfortunately to be expected, and can make everything feel so much worse, right? Like it does have sleep deprivation. Of course, there's a huge impact on exacerbating anxiety, and it makes I think there is a certain like desperation, right? Of like,
Hmm.
what do I need to do to get some sleep, right? Like, is it if I had this better sleep sack, if the room was a different temperature, like would we all get better sleep? Or like, of course you want, this like unicorn like 12-hour stretch or something. I mean, hey, 3-hour stretch, right? For would be great. But like I think like it's understandable why it becomes such an obsession, but I
Hmm.
think also we don't do any favors in like the way we talk about it. Or I always wish there was more normalization of like, yes, this is just a temporary period of time where like you're likely to get less sleep than you need, and it's really hard, but like it's going to be over at some point. And
Hmm.
there are things you can do, and like you're kind of getting at like listening to that like intuition, or what we would say in parts work therapy, like core self, like what does your core self need, or like what is your intuition like leading you towards in terms of like the right way to handle this.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like for every parent at every age, but especially an anxious parent and especially, parent of a baby, because there's so much messaging, like fear-based messaging around sleep.
Mm-hmm.
We always have to start with like what's normal.
Mm.
Because normal doesn't mean easy. Normal doesn't mean that we can't optimize because modern life is pretty bad for sleep. So, like, almost every
Mhm.
family has things they can do, like from a sleep hygiene perspective, or from a sharing the load between parents perspective. Like, almost every
Yeah.
family has things they can do that could make things easier at any age. And yeah, we really just have to start with like, what is normal? Because I don't know. I see so many parents, anxious people or not, who are so like worried about what's normal because in mainstream ways that we talk about sleep, we define normal by sleep training outcomes, not actually by what's healthy and normal for young children's sleep. And so
Hmm.
that's enough to send any parent on an anxiety spiral if they're like, oh, after 6 months, my baby should be sleeping 12 hours through the night and not need night feeds and fall asleep independently and be happy in their crib. And it's like, that's how society defines healthy sleep. But
Right.
that's like so far from what most babies are doing and what is
Right. Right.
actually, developmentally healthy sleep. That is like that gap enough is like
Yeah.
enough to send anyone into a like, oh my God, what is going on here?
Right.
Let alone someone who has that already has anxiety, um,
Hmm.
in general. It's like
Hmm.
it's so tricky.
Yes. Totally. Yes. Yes. Yeah. And I think, and anxiety often goes hand in hand with like some negative self-talk, right? So like,
Hmm.
you know, oh, why, what's wrong with me, right? Like, what's wrong with me that my baby is not sleeping this way? Or
Yes.
like, what's wrong you know, with the way I'm handling X, Y, and Z? Or, we tend to, more anxious people or people who are prone to like some depression or anxiety tend to like place the blame on themselves, right? Or like,
Hmm.
um, kind of speak to themselves in that more negative self-talk kind of way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I feel like the way that a lot of people talk about sleep, it only encourages that, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of messaging out there about sleep that puts it all on parents. Like if you would just do this, and be
Right.
consistent, then your baby would sleep like that. And so there is a lot of blaming messaging
Yes.
already out there externally from a parent, and then the tendency to blame yourself internally as well. It gets reinforced, I feel like, by that
Hmm.
really common like sleep training culture messaging that's
Yes.
out there.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. And I love that you mentioned like unfollow the accounts, right? Because I think the more
Yes.
noise we have, right, that's like kind of, it's again, our anxiety is really looking for like evidence that we need to worry, right? Like, let me
Hmm.
look for things that can make me things to worry about. I mean, anyone who's like, been down a Google rabbit hole, right? Or, which is every parent, like,
Yes.
will tell you that you can find, if you're looking for the scary thing, you will find it, right? Like, it is out there somewhere, some scary evidence for your anxiety brain to really take in and make you believe that, again, like something's wrong, or you're doing something wrong. So like I always really encourage my clients with anxiety or OCD to limit the amount of like content they're taking in if they can.
Yeah.
Or like be aware of the ways that you're seeking reassurance. Like reassurance can be a great thing, but it can also become like a little bit, it can also reinforce the anxiety, right? Like, oh, I
Yeah.
just need to make sure that like I'm doing everything right, right?
Yeah. It's interesting because I feel like I see two different kinds of anxious parents at my work. And this is actually something I've been talking a lot about over the last year, like in generalizations, trying to figure out like a little bit more about how to differentiate how I support anxious parents, right? Because I get some anxious parents who I don't know if it's that their anxiety is better managed, but I feel like I am a tool in their toolbox. And so we kind of they're very ready to narrow down who they're listening to, right?
Mm,
And so they want someone to debrief with, like just to check in as things change. And we'll do like, more intense work at the beginning, of course. But then they like that like space to be like, hey, let me talk you through what I did. Or, help me think through a few options for how to handle this day next week that's going to be really crazy. And like I get to actually show them that they know more than they know, right? Like once we've been working
Mm,
together for a while, and I'm like, that's great, that's perfect, that's exactly what I would have done, or maybe like, hey, here's how we can think through this. And then I get some anxious parents who it's so hard for them to step away from Googling everything.
hmm.
And so
Yeah.
it's like it's harder to get them to kind of pick a path. And I mean, I never say like you should only listen to me when you're working with me because that's dumb. There's so many great voices out there. But I do encourage like, okay, if we're going this path, we need to go this path. So like, let's
Hmm.
make sure if you want to bring other things you're seeing to me and we can talk about it, great. But it gets hard when I feel like some anxious parents get really trapped in that I have to Google everything and consume
Yeah.
huge amounts of content, and then they keep reading things that are not in aligned with the path they have chosen,
Hmm.
as in, they're paying to work with me. So
Right, right,
like
right.
they're still looking at sleep training information, and we have to keep having the same kind of conversation over and over, that it's like, no, your baby does not have to go down drowsy but awake in your crib. Like that's
Hmm.
not the only way to get healthy sleep, right? Because their baby's maybe struggling with that, as an example, and I
Hmm.
feel like they can get really stuck, and it can be really challenging, to be
Hmm.
like, we got to build up people who are at least coming at sleep from the same angle. Otherwise, you just keep spinning, and
Yeah.
spiraling,
Yeah.
wasting a lot of
Yeah.
energy. That is
It is.
exhausting.
Yes.
So tiring.
Yeah. Anxiety, being in that anxiety spiral, or like we would call, like if in OCD, like the OCD bubble, like is exhausting. It's totally exhausting, taking all your energy. Yeah, that's interesting that you kind of notice these differences. And I think it does sound like from as a therapist, I use a lot of like talking about parts and our different parts
Mhm.
of ourselves. And I think often like the anxious part, we learn over time how to like engage with it, right? And sometimes we can access that core self, that intuition, to say like, my anxious part is really questioning my decision to like, you know commit to whatever I'm going to do. I decided I'm going to keep nursing to sleep. But my anxious part is like, is that the right thing? Is that what I should do? But like, what is my core self or my intuition saying? Right. Like, and I think it takes time and it takes work to try to feel like it's safe to rely on our intuition, or
Mhm.
it's safe to like, we say to that anxious part, like, it's okay, we actually don't need you right now, we figured it out, like we're okay, you can take a seat, right? But that's hard. That anxious part is like, well, I thought I was always needed, like your whole life I've been like working really hard to protect you, I don't feel safe enough to like stop. So anyway,
Mhm.
just kind of like engaging in that work, I think is a lot of what I do with anxious clients. And I can imagine, it sounds like for some of your clients, it's easier to access that intuition than others potentially.
Yeah, and I feel like for some parents who are anxious, like and this is like my non-therapist perspective, right?
Yeah.
It feels like once they find that path that is speaking to them, it's easier for them to like step into it. And maybe they need some reassurance, of course, as we all do along the way. And I feel like for other parents, it is so hard even to like cut through all the noise to figure
Yeah.
out that path of like, what are my values, what it feels right, what's working for us. Like they can't
Hmm.
shut out the noise. It's like the anxiety is all the noise dialed up too loud. I don't know if that makes sense, or how you would sort of
Yeah.
debrief that like in a proper way.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that does. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I like that analogy. There is so much noise. I think figuring out our values in general is like it's a hard task. And they change, right? Like they can change, or they can be unearthed, right? Like maybe we didn't know that we actually are, our values in parenting were XYZ. And it does take some work, and like listening to those parts of listening to the anxiety. Like, I know I shared with you offline, like I personally went through this with sleep, where I
Mm-hmm.
was like, okay, like I am exhausted, I am ready to sleep train, like hardcore, like we're doing it, like letting the baby cry, and like fully of the mind that like whatever works for you and your kid is the best choice, right? Like no judgment. But for me, I had so much anxiety with going through this process. My kid needs a lot of sensory input to go to sleep, and
Mm-hmm.
has always been this way. It became very clear that this was not going to work for us. But I think it was a process of like, okay, let me listen to, like, I'm feeling anxious. That to me, that says this maybe isn't the right thing. I'm feeling there's some kind of intuitive sense that this isn't what he needs. What can I try differently? But then of course there's still, well, all these people sleep trained and it worked for them and they get better sleep. And this is how, all the noise that it does take
Mm-hmm.
time, I think, to work through. And yeah, again, it just takes some practice. And I think it depends on, your personal history, what you've been through in your life, the work that you maybe have done, whether you have support. Like, do you have a partner that's saying like, okay, yeah, like, let's do if you're thinking that's the right way, let's go with it. Right. Or
Mm-hmm.
other resources, like working with someone like yourself who's able to say like, you got this. Like you can do things differently, or you can do things how you want to do them. And even now, I mean, like, still there's parts of media that's like, oh well, you should handle toddler sleep this way. And it's like, you gotta double down and remember, those values that you have, and how kind of trusting yourself, I think, it's a hard thing to do, and it takes a
Yeah.
while to get there.
I feel like with sleep and maybe with like discipline as you move into the toddler
Mm,
years and beyond,
yeah.
it's not ever like a one and done
Yeah.
thing for the vast majority of parents, because there's constant pressure and there's
Hmm.
constant undermining, whether it's just broadly culturally or like specifically from your own family or healthcare providers. And so it's like a constant recommitment. Like I run a group coaching program for sleep, and it is like older babies, younger toddlers, and folks
Hmm.
get access, like ongoing access to the whole time.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I love is when people will go in, well, I don't love that this happens, but they go into their pediatrician sends them on some anxiety spiral about why they're not sleep training. And they just come out and hop on to group coach, and they're like, can we just debrief? And you just remind me of all the
Yes.
evidence for why responsiveness is not only valid, but healthy. And
Yes.
they just need to hear it again, right? Like they know it. We've talked about it before. They have the videos that talk about it, and they just want to like debrief after like having an authority figure tell them that
Hmm.
they're destroying their baby's sleep, which is
Yes.
so absurd. Or, they have a really bad conversation with their mother-in-law or their best friend who's like
Yeah.
very gung-ho in sleep training, and they're a bed sharing family, and just that re-engaging with like strengthening not your resolve, but strengthening that trust in yourself that like you were
Hmm.
made these decisions for a reason. They're actually working for you. And there's actually a lot of evidence, developmental attachment, neuroscience evidence, and sleep evidence to support that path,
Right.
and like
Yeah.
revisiting that.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. That, I think that highlights, I love the ongoing coaching program, because I think it highlights the importance of social support, right? Like we
Mm-hmm.
can't exist. We're not supposed to parent in like, a vacuum in our own little nuclear family.
Mm-hmm.
And how, like you said, the noise, I mean, how impactful when it's coming from an authority figure, someone you are supposed to or hoping to trust, right? Where how
Mm-hmm.
confusing is it when you're hearing like, oh, this is wrong, or you should be doing things differently, which unfortunately I think happens all the time. But
Yes.
yeah, having
Yes.
that reinforcement, that social support of like a community that's like shares your values, so important.
Yeah. So if a parent is very anxious about
Hmm.
sleep or just their parenting approach in general, and they don't feel like they have connected with their values or their intuition around that. I know history and all sorts of like how much work have they done with their anxiety. I know that's all going to come
Yeah.
into play, but like for someone listening, where would you suggest that they start? Like how do you start
Hmm.
reflecting on that as a
Hmm.
parent?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. One of the first things I think about is, looking at your own experience as a child and how you were parented. And I think most of us have done this work throughout our lives, but like, what are the things that you experienced or that your parents did or your parent did that you want to keep or you don't want to keep, right? What are the things that you're like, that's a yes, that's a no? Even like getting comfortable with tuning into that like intuitive, enthusiastic, like yes or no, right? Like, even if it's just like, oh, I love how at Christmas time we always went to see these lights or whatever, like whatever basic experience you had as a kid that like made you feel good or didn't feel good. And like, what is it about that experience, do you think, that is something that either was affirming to you and made you feel connected and loved or not? And I think like those are really great places to start to draw out like our own values. Alternately, you can look to the future. Like, what do I want my kid to feel like? What do I want them to, who do I want them to be? Right. I think that's also a great place to kind of like hone in on your values. And if you have a partner, you can do this with even better, right? To like think through a lot of this. And most likely you've had some of these conversations. I think, also naming, to your point, like what is the noise? Like what are the things that when you start to think about your values, what are the like, but so and so said this, my pediatrician said I'm supposed to sleep train, or my sister-in-law, did XYZ and, that was harmful for their kid, whatever it is. Naming that kind of that ambivalence, if you have it. And otherwise, I think the things that we talked about, like, therapy, therapy is great. But engaging supports, like if you can engage with whatever tools you have. I mean, even if it's like listening to a podcast, like, or if you can't necessarily like, get a sleep consultant or find a group, but like social support, finding community, huge. I think I know, I work with the womb room that has a lot of great social support opportunities to just connect with like parents. And yeah, I think like doing that work to kind of parse through it all. If you're feeling like you're in a place where your anxiety or OCD or is just like through the roof, you're not able to, and I think often the tell for that is when it feels like in our bodies, we're just like keyed up all the time, right? Or we can't, we can't focus on like being present with our kid or being present with, work or our family. Like that's when I would say like therapy and medication are like a great option. There's so many there's medication that's safe during pregnancy and breastfeeding. There's just like mental health treatment options if you feel like you're in a place where you're actually like not functioning in the way that you would like to be. Like turning the dial of that anxiety dial down from like a 10 to like a 7 to just try to be able to then tune in, right? Because I think that intuition is harder to access when we're just like so on our anxiety is at a 10. But again, the plus of all of this is that there is, therapy, medication, and support groups are all like evidence-based treatments for perinatal anxiety. So there is hope, right? And the nature of this, I think, is that it often does get easier, right? As we move through the parenting space. New challenges, but easier on globally, I think.
Yeah. And with like, not parents who are kind of anxieties up in that like 8, 9, 10 space, but like when the anxiety is more in the middle space, and I have anxious clients. First of all, I always love when they self-disclose that they have an anxiety history and that they have a therapist. That makes me super happy. I love working with when my clients have anxiety. I love it when they already have a therapist. I'm even more excited when they have an attachment-based therapist, because sometimes the therapists are like, you can't bed share, that's why you're not sleeping. And I'm just like, bang head against wall. We should be teaching all perinatal providers about norms. But anyway, different conversation. I just love when it's like, what actually feels good? Like, how do you want your baby, if they could look back, how do you want them to feel around sleep? Right? Like, and is this doing that? Not to like murder the parent. Like, we can still make changes within that. We can still make parent-led changes, but like, are we supporting their emotions? Are we meeting their needs? How does that feel? And, how do you want sleep to feel to them? Because we're creating that foundation for their relationship with sleep. And
Absolutely.
it's tricky, and it doesn't have to be all or nothing. Um,
Hmm.
but I
Yeah.
just I love getting people can start to tune into what feels like a good fit for their kiddo's temperament, for their
Hmm.
relationship with their little one. And I love that you brought up sometimes we have to really have some medication and more intense therapy to kind of get to the point
Yeah.
that you can do that kind of
Hmm.
reflective work.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
I want to circle back a little
Hmm.
bit to something we were talking about a bit earlier in the conversation about when anxiety is preventing you as a parent from sleeping.
Yes.
Um, I see this a lot. To be really honest, I see this a lot with the anxious clients I work with, and I am certainly always encouraging them to brainstorm with their therapist if they have a therapist. But
Hmm.
I know a lot of what I'm talking to them about is how do we dial down your nervous system, right? Because you have
Hmm.
to be able to relax to sleep. But I would love to hear what you talk about with folks when their anxiety is really disrupting their sleep, and they think maybe it's all about their baby sleep, but it's not. Um,
Hmm.
it's never all about baby sleep. It is every parent has stuff they can do to support their own sleep, but when it's anxiety that's really in the mix, how do
Hmm.
you talk with parents about that?
Absolutely. Yes. Um, well, I think it does, of course, depend on like what's happening, right? Like,
Of course, yeah.
is it that like you're worrying, or is it that you just feel like you can't quite settle, or is it that what's really going on, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you mention all the like basic sleep hygiene stuff, right? Which is like, you know, um, I think sometimes harder when you have if you have a young infant, right? And for example, if you're going to just be, I think often where we see where I see insomnia early on is like in those early months where, you know, all of a sudden a longer stretch of sleep is not accessible. And, I am going to be waking up like sometimes every hour, sometimes every 2 to 3 hours or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It's really a huge shift for your brain, right? That's always been like, oh, we just get to go to sleep and then we sleep for as long as we can and then we wake up. And
Mm-hmm.
I think like, it's a big adjustment. And I think sometimes if you have a history of maybe anxiety or more sleep related anxiety, that like getting back up and then being like awake and your brain turning on and like not necessarily being able to get back. Often though, I think the anxiety comes when we know we are going to be tired tomorrow, or like we're like worrying about the exhaustion, right? So like,
Yes. Yes.
I mean, we've all experienced like you have to wake up early and you can't sleep and you're like, oh, I have this big thing in the morning and I'm
Yeah.
gonna be like so tired for it, and it makes it even harder.
Mm-hmm.
um, and I think that can happen, in which case I would encourage a like reframe in the way you're thinking about your sleep. Like, okay, like maybe you're going to be up right now. Can you take a nap at some point tomorrow? Can you,
Mm-hmm.
can you, do you want to get up and do the dishes now or wash your pump or whatever because you're awake and you're not going to be able to, then you can sleep when you would be doing that in the morning or whatever. Like, are there both ways you can reframe your cognitions around sleep? And are there ways that potentially like your behaviors, you can change your behaviors to, um, not try to just like lay in your bed and force yourself back there. So that's one thing I think about. The other thing I was thinking about is just like you said, this keyed up nervous system, right? That sometimes
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden we're just like in such a different place with a baby, right? Or with with kids. Like just taking those moments throughout the day to try to bring things down. Like whether it's like, you know, okay, I'm gonna put in my headphones and like put on some calming music, or like try to do like a body scan while I'm nursing, or you know, any moment. I mean, it could literally be I'm just gonna stand here and take a deep breath
Mm-hmm.
while I'm like making this bottle or whatever. Small little sprinkles of mindfulness. I think, it's really hard, but I think it can be helpful in just being, and the first step would even just be being aware, right? Oh, wow, I am like rushing around. My heart's racing a little bit.
Yeah.
I don't know if that feels like it answers your question,
It
but
does, and it is actually really in alignment with what I do and
Mhm.
suggest, right? That we have to, like the cognitive, like affirmations, like reminding, yourself what's normal, bringing yourself out of the like spiraling about like, what's the point of going to sleep? They're just gonna be up in 2 hours. I'm just gonna lay here
Mhm.
and, like the cognitive piece, but then that nervous system downregulation piece and
Yeah,
how can we practice those regulation tools?
absolutely.
I love that because sleep is so much about regulation. And so if we're dysregulated from anxiety, then, or anything, right? Worry, stress, whatever, your sleep quality is just not gonna, it's just not gonna be where it could be,
Mhm.
regardless of how a baby is sleeping. And I think that that gets lost sometimes.
Yeah.
You know, uh, and since the most basic solution is always just sleep train your baby and you'll get more sleep and then your anxiety will be better, it's like it just doesn't work that way on so many levels. For a
Mhm.
lot of parents, it might for some, and that's okay. But for a lot of parents, that's just so much more complicated than that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yes. I totally agree. And the other thing I'm thinking about is like sensory supports for yourself, right? Like,
Yeah.
um, a lot of times there can be discomfort, like it's less comfortable sleeping, whether it's because you have a baby in bed with you or because your body is just in feeling some physical pain or like how can you making things more comfortable, whether it's like you know whatever it could be, small things, taking a shower before you, if that's what you want to do before bed, or like
Mhm.
some self massage or putting new sheets on the bed, or you know again putting something in your headphones or
Yeah.
whatever before having a warm beverage or something like before sleep, just kind of those sensory supports because we neglect those when we're
Hmm.
so focused on our kids sleep too, or
Yep.
a child in general.
So true. Ah, I love that. I love that. This is so much of the stuff that I'm doing too. Like
Great.
that you're approaching it from such a similar way, obviously with the clinical anxiety, actual
Yeah.
knowledge, but I look a lot at parent sleep. Like that's part of my approach in general, like regardless of the families, that it's not all on baby
Yes.
to change.
Yeah.
Because usually they're sleeping fairly normally, sometimes quite wakefully, but still there's work to be done on baby, sure, but there's almost always work that we can do on that parent side of taking care of their own sleep, of setting themselves up as as well as they can.
Absolutely.
Just sort of as we're wrapping up and we're thinking about like how does anxiety play into these early parenting decisions and thoughts and experiences, do you feel like there's anything important that we haven't touched on that maybe we should kind of leave folks with at the end of this conversation?
I think just echoing the message that, you know, some anxiety is to be expected, but also there's always, there's no need to like suffer a white knuckle through it, right? Like there's support
Hmm.
available to you, whether that be engaging with a therapist or, just or trying medication or just someone that can help you kind of, someone like yourself who can help coach you through like what is it that you're feeling anxious about? What is it that you need more support around? Um, we have so many wonderful resources now available, and there's always help out there. There's always an opportunity to, air the thing that's making you feel anxious and kind of make the changes. It's such a treatable, um, uh, you know, condition. So I think just kind of echoing that. Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. Claire, I'm going to get this information from you, but also
Mm-hmm.
where can folks find you if they're local? All your work is in person, yeah? Or do you do virtual
It's
stuff?
actually it's virtual. So
Okay.
most of my work is virtual. I am Baltimore based, but can see clients anywhere in Maryland virtually.
Hmm.
I my website is kindhealingmd.com. And I'm also on Instagram at kind.healing. I see some clients and do some support group work through the Womb Room in Baltimore.
Hmm. Great resource.
And yes, wonderful resource. And I think that's pretty much it. My email is Clare Donofrio, LCSWC@gmail.com. But thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to connect with you today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for joining me today. I hope this episode left you feeling more informed, confident, and encouraged on your sleep journey. And just a reminder before you go that nothing in this episode is individualized to your specific sleep situation, nor is it to be taken as medical advice. Take what resonates, ignore what doesn't, and check with your healthcare provider about any medical concerns. Take a moment to subscribe to this podcast so that you'll never miss an episode. And take a moment to rate, review, or share an episode you love on social media. All of that helps parents just like you find me, this podcast, and this gentle and responsive sleep information. I'll see you next time.